Hello, everyone. Greetings from Brazil. So, what I would like to do, make 4 main points here. I know usually they recommend that you stick to 3, but I can never follow the rules very well. So I'll go for 4 points. First of all, kind of touch upon again of what Alistair said, the role of international water law. So we're talking about the UN Watercourses Convention here, which brings international water law together into one document. So that brings us back to the question, why international water law is important to begin with. And so what international water law does and why the convention was adopted to facilitate sound water management in transboundary basins, ultimately leading to the achievement of larger conservation and development goals. And through history, experience, and my colleagues that have been working on this for far longer than I can attest to that than me, international law has been a central tenet of good cooperation. It has played a vital role. And it's actually among the most influential factors in how states behave in their relations pertaining to international waters. So if we reach this conclusion, then automatically we get to the point of thinking, well, if international law has this important role to play, what can we do to make it even stronger, to enhance that role so that it's definitely fulfilling its intended functions? So, and that leads me to the second point, the status of international water law. As Ali said, we still have a very fragmented state of things. If we look at most of transboundary basins in the world, most of these basins are not covered by specific agreements. Even where we do have agreements, a lot of them have gaps and weaknesses, as we could see, or they fail to cover the entire basins. They exclude groundwater, or they don't involve all the basin states, for example. And then we can talk about specific examples during the questions after that. Another problem that we have is that some basins are covered by too many agreements that are not necessarily aligned with each other. And a lot of states out there are parties to a set of different agreements, again, not aligned, and that has not facilitated, that has not made implementation easy. I think that's the case in Central Asia, for example, where you have, one may think, too many agreements, in fact, and sometimes pointing to different directions, sometimes overlapping, and just making implementation of those really, really hard. So in this scenario of too many agreements or not enough in some places, how do we ensure that international law is actually a tool to facilitate and not make things more difficult? And that's where we come up with the idea of the multi-level governance of transboundary waters, where you have different instruments at different levels that are mutually reinforcing and supplementing one another. And that's where the Watercourses Convention would come at the global level, supplementing agreements at the basin, sub-basin, or regional level, to codify, clarify, and contribute to the development of international law. And in sum, what is the Watercourses Convention? It is a clear, stable framework of cooperation at the global level. And so in this context of the multi-level governance of transboundary waters. Very quickly moving into the third point, and here Salman will discuss this in greater detail, but from my perspective, from the experience that I've had working on the ratification process at the World Wildlife Fund, and very closely with Ali and Owen here and Remy, entry into force is going to represent ultimately, both legally and politically, the milestone of when we talk of successful codification and development of the law. It's not that all the problems are solved here, but it is a milestone that all the efforts of the International Law Commission have come to fruition. It's a process, and entry into force represents this milestone. And then where we go from here, I'm going to touch that on that in a second. So now parties, the states that ratify, will have a common legal basis that it's clear, that is broad enough to cover a number of situations, and that it's binding on all of them, and ultimately sediments the rules and the principles of international water law, and even more of that, more important, where the direction that these existing rules are evolving. And Owen will talk about ecosystem protection and how the convention does that. So where we are and where we are going, and eliminating any questions that the countries might have is equitable use an important principle. Once the convention enters into force and it's binding upon those parties, everything that it's in there, it's agreed upon by the states. You don't have to discuss anymore what's customary, what's not, what's developing, what's not. Everything is agreed upon. So it's an accepted basis for negotiation. I think that's very important. And very practical aspects here. So getting out, moving beyond the very legalistic world. One thing that we saw when we were working on ratification is in many places there was just not awareness, not knowledge of what the convention represented, and that made ratification itself very difficult. What entry into force does is raise the level of awareness of the convention, puts it under the spotlight even more, and we can see that countries are more curious about it and what it does and why it's important. So that kind of political power, entry into force, increases that to a significant extent. And what we hope will happen from a ratification perspective, of course, entry into force is one step. What we would like to see in 5 years, maybe hopefully sooner than that, is universal ratification like we have for the other environmental conventions. So, and what we think could happen with entry into force is a snowball effect. Now more and more countries will become interested, more and more will ratify, and we'll have eventually an even more powerful instrument that we can use. And so bringing these effects together, what we have is greater clarity of the law and an understanding of what the law represents among a larger set of countries. And the expectation or the assumption is that those two elements, greater clarity and a shared understanding, would lead to better levels of cooperation. And just to give you two quick examples here, and then I'll close. I'm no authority on the situation of the Nile Basin, but just what I follow in the media and through my colleagues, the last development was that Ethiopia and Egypt would agree on a process going forward to discuss the potential impacts of the Renaissance Dam. Were they parties to the Watercourses Convention, they wouldn't have to go through this one additional step. They would simply know from the other that whenever one wanted to develop the watercourse, they would have to follow the standards and the procedures of the Watercourses Convention. So instead of going through this one additional step, let's create a committee. And then they moved back from the committee. Negotiations were stalled for a few months, and now they are back at the table and they're going to agree on the steps to follow. So why go through all this? Why make cooperation so difficult when you have the steps set out in the Watercourses Convention? So an example of where the convention would have a very strong facilitating role to play. And then the other function that the convention plays is to support existing multilateral environmental agreements. So, for example, in the case of Ramsar, I think largely due to imminent entry into force, Ramsar is working on this paper now, looking at relations between the regime that Ramsar creates with the broader regime of international water law, and once the convention enters into force, the UNECE Water Convention becomes global, how Ramsar can help with implementation of the water conventions and vice versa. So that awareness itself, entry into force, is creating and leading to the parties to the Ramsar Convention to think about these issues as well. So one legal example, one more practical example. Scott, how am I with time? Do I have time for one final point?
Yeah, if you could make it brief.
Brief, yeah.
Thank you.
I will. So upon entry into force, we are we have a very important and urgent window of opportunity here to prepare for entry into force. As we know, this is due to happen now in August. The convention will enter into force with Vietnam's ratification. So three things here to keep in mind, and hopefully we'll go back to these during questions. The convention is not isolated. It's going to be part of a broader context of an existing transboundary water management governance framework. There are a lot of actors out there already working on this issue. So the convention has to be seen within this context. And then the big question is, what can those organizations do to support the parties to the convention now that it's entering into force? And then we can think about the Global Environment Facility, river basin organizations. UNEP is having a forum in November this year that will, among other issues, discuss exactly that, bring the river basin organizations around the world together and say, the convention is now in force. What facilitating role can you play to your member states with regard to that? The other point, coordination with the UNECE Water Convention. This is also a global instrument now. Soon countries will be able to ratify. We'll have 2 global water conventions. How do we make the best out of this and without creating confusion on the other hand? And Remy will go in detail on this issue, but it's something important to keep in mind. And then the final point, through the experience of ratification, what we've learned is the absence of a established basis for the convention or an institutional home has made it very difficult, has made things much harder when it came to ratification, because there was no one champion, one authorized with authority to pull countries together to the ratification process. This is even more important when we think about interpretation, application, and implementation. So the convention does not have provisions on secretariat and meeting of the parties. We don't expect that those things will exist immediately upon entry into force. I think there's a lot more discussions to happen, weigh the benefits of, do we really need these instruments, and then the financial and political costs involved. But the key point that I wanted to leave the audience with is we need to have things better organized now than we did while we were at the ratification stage, including to motivate more countries to ratify. So how we create, however informal, how we create some sort of institutional home, building upon what's already out there, the Watercourses Convention Global Initiative that WWF worked on with Dundee, Salman, Owen, and IWRA. How do we build on this experience, the experience of the UNECE Water Convention, to make sure countries have the backing that they need, the funds, the support, to now start talking about implementation? And that's for the existing structure working on transboundary water management to advise on, and then for the countries that have ratified to make a decision. So with that, I thank you, Scott, again for that invitation, and looking forward to the other speakers.
Well, thank you very much. I think that was a very informative presentation, and I appreciate your perspective as almost someone who boots on the ground. It was a very learning from the work you've done. Thank you for that.